We've been working through a book in the New Testament called 1 Corinthians. It's actually a letter that's written by a character. His name is Paul. People call him the Apostle Paul or the Sent One Paul. He's someone that Jesus kind of turned around in a very striking way. He was actually a very zealous Jewish religious man, part of a group called the Pharisees. And I mean, they had a lot of commitment, but he really thought Jesus was a fraud. And then he had this experience where he claimed Jesus appeared to him in a blinding light, kind of like in a vision type experience, as he was going to try to put some other followers of Jesus in the city in Syria in jail, essentially. And on the way, Jesus interrupted him and changed his life forever, which is an interesting story. Recommend it if you've never read that story before. But after that point, he started traveling around the Roman Empire to different major cities, trying to start communities of Jesus followers. He would often engage with the Jewish community there because they had a background on the God of the Bible already. And then from there, he would reach out to the other people as well. And so the book of Corinthians is written to a church in the ancient city of Corinth. It's in the middle of ancient Greece, essentially. But it had a lot of Roman characteristics, and it had a lot of pride. And so our series is titled Honor versus Humility. And I think one of the things that Paul was really hoping that these believers would grasp is the huge difference between the way that their society was just encouraging people to get all the honor and the worth and the positions and the wealth imaginable, like just climb that ladder of success, to compare that with what they knew of Jesus on the cross, which was much more sacrificial, which was much more humble. And so he's trying to set that example before them consistently. And now we're in a portion of this letter where he starts to address some different issues and some concerns that he has about the way that people in this church are engaging those social issues. And so we're going to talk this morning about a quick topic. It's called Christ to Our Community. It's going to look at a very specific aspect of how the Corinthians were affecting, I guess you could say, their ability to represent Jesus well in that community. So there could be hundreds of different ways to apply this, but we're going to look at one specific instance that was happening in the Corinthian church at this point in time and try to learn some things from it personally. How can we apply that 2,000 years later in our churches and our cultures? But I want to give you a quick review. Last week, and the week prior to that, we're looking at this issue of judgment because I know that's kind of a buzzword. How many of you like to be judged by people? Right? We all love that. And Paul in chapter 4, the first part of this letter, he tells the Corinthians, for the most part, don't get judgy. Don't avoid judging, because when you judge people, it just creates relationship conflicts unnecessarily. But then he follows up and he says, but not always. Sometimes people are being abusive toward other people, and so you can't just let those things go. You have to confront those types of issues. And now he's going to come to another aspect of kind of maybe a time when we do have to exercise judgment as a community of people together, and that's when we need to avoid misrepresenting Jesus to our community. Sometimes we look at ourselves as a church and we realize we have some habits that are just like not doing Jesus a favor, because people see how we're interacting with the community around us and they think thoughts like, if that's how those people at that church act, then, and Jesus feels the same way. I don't want anything to do with them and I don't want anything to do with Jesus. That's the kind of impression that this church, I think, was making in ancient Corinth. And Paul says there's something that you're doing that you need to put the brakes on, because it's really affecting how people see Jesus reflected in your life in this community. And people are coming to some wrong conclusions about who Jesus is because of the way that you're treating each other. So we're going to look into that this morning. As we do this, it's a situation where we're looking at some legal proceedings, and probably the best way to do this is just to jump in. We're in chapter 6, starting in verses 1. We'll be working through about 11 verses this morning as we read, again, a portion of Paul's mail to this church in ancient Corinth. And he's switching gears here a little bit from, how you judge certain situations or avoid judging certain situations within the church, and he's looking outside to the community relationships now. And he says, does any one of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? We hear that word saints in the Bible. It sounds kind of intimidating. It sounds like you should probably have done about 10 miracles and been a great person your entire life and never had any major flaws to attain a title like that. But that's not what it means. In the Bible, it just means somebody who's been separated for a purpose. And so it's hinting that we, as followers of Jesus, have been separated for a purpose. We'll get to that in just a moment. But before we get to that, Paul's talking about courts, law proceedings, lawsuits in ancient Corinth. And there's a few details we need to understand because things operated differently in ancient Corinth than they do in the United States of America in 2024. Court systems were a little different. So here's some stuff that you need to know, background information. First of all, the local Roman legal system, it was biased, it was expensive, and it was very corrupt. Local courts have been established in cities throughout the Roman Empire to kind of alleviate some of the caseloads that were piling up in Rome, because Rome wanted to deal with the serious crimes and the big issues, but they didn't want to deal with every little petty issue that all these cities around the entire empire had. They couldn't deal with that. And so they said, cities, you guys have officials, and so you put your officials over the civil cases and you bring the more serious stuff to us. Now, there were some rules about how things worked. If you were a slave, if you were a child, if you had been a slave and you were freed, if you were just a normal private citizen of Rome, or if you had low social rank, you could not file a lawsuit against a parent, a patron, which was somebody who had more wealth in your society, who normally people of lower rank or lower amounts of wealth, they would kind of butter them up and establish relationships with somebody who was wealthier in hopes that some of that wealth would trickle down onto them. Maybe if I become good friends with somebody who's pretty wealthy, people will look on me more highly because I have a friend who's wealthy. Maybe that friend will invite me to dinner, and that's going to be a lot better than the basic menu that I've got in my life. Maybe they're going to give me some connections to a job, or even like an opportunity to be involved in local, politics as an official or something. You never know where that train could lead, and so we're going to cozy up to these people with more wealth and do whatever we can to get on their good side. Okay? So they were called patrons in society, people who could help you get ahead. So you couldn't file a lawsuit against a parent, against a patron, against a city official, or against somebody who was a higher class, of higher rank, which usually meant more wealth, a family that had been connected for generations in that area, somebody who had political connections to someone in Rome. You couldn't file lawsuits against those people. Because if you did, that would be a social insult to those people. And we can't have social insults because our society doesn't work that way. Also, if you're looking to figure out who the judges and the jury are, they're also the wealthy and the elite people who have status in the local city. And so not only do you have to have status to file a lawsuit, but can you guess whose side the people who are judges and juries are going to be on? Right, people in their same social class. So of course there's partiality in the judgments. Bribery is common. You can just pay people off to give them a better judgment. So only people who were wealthy could afford the cost of attorney fees and court fees and legal documents because they were kind of absurd. And so it was something that people would use to put pressure or leverage on people who were less than them in different ways in society. So it was like a power play when you took somebody to court, or it was used against somebody of the same social rank and you were trying to outdo them and win a case against them so that your social status went up and theirs went down a little bit. You gained more honor in that city and they gained a little more shame in the city because they lost to you. So it was very much, it wasn't about justice. It was about power and domination and asserting your ability and your influence in a city. That's why people would take each other to court. And so they would hold dramatic trials in the forum, the marketplace, where some of the government buildings were as well, in the center of the community. And they would have, a lot of times, they would pay people who were excelling at oratory skills to give these very flamboyant speeches, very dramatic speeches, and everybody could attend. Anyone could come. And so people would come for patrons. Anybody that patron had been helping support financially or been, giving a leg up in their culture, they would come and cheer their patron on. And then they would heckle and boo the people who were on the opposing side. And kind of the judge and, the jury, they'd figure out how this is being perceived by the crowd, and then they would make their biased decision ultimately at the end and award somebody the victory, and somebody would come away with the loss. And if you came away with the loss, it was a hit to your character and your standing in the community. And so people would usually fight back, and sometimes they would take revenge on the people who won the lawsuits. Character assassination was common. They would say whatever they could to degrade your character and your reliability in public. So that's a Roman court setting in these towns and cities. So can you understand why Paul would make a statement like, why would you dare to go to court in a city like this when you have a problem with your neighbor? That's the background behind it. So he's saying, as a church, you've been set apart to be different. You're saints. You're set apart ones. You're supposed to be impartial. And you're supposed to be loving when you navigate these kinds of situations. And you're supposed to be just. You're supposed to prevent injustice, not, promote it, not promote unfair treatment and biased decisions. You're supposed to be the ideal kind of community as a church for navigating conflicts, unlike what's happening at the courts down the road in the Forum in ancient Corinth. So that system's biased. As a church, you're supposed to be a different kind of community within the community of ancient Corinth. He says in verse 2, or do you not know that the saints, the set apart ones, will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest cases? You know that verse that we read in Psalm 8 this morning? Those verses talks about how we look at ourselves and we feel so insignificant, but in reality, God sees us as very significant, and he has some really significant purposes for us now and in the future. And it seems like Paul is kind of connecting with that. And he's making statements. Essentially, he's saying that you have been set apart to make decisions differently, with a different set of values than your society, in order to mediate conflicts and maintain peace in the world, not just now, but when Jesus returns. Someday in the future, you're going to be involved in perhaps deciding cases in the world. And this isn't something that we see all over Scripture, but Paul seems to have it on his radar to some degree. So it's hard to flesh it out and figure out exactly, all that this entails. But Jesus said something similar to his disciples in Matthew 19. And again, that was a group of 12 people, but maybe similar things apply to us. And this is where it goes into a little bit of, conjecture and imagination and guesswork. But Jesus tells his disciples at one point, says, Peter responded and said to him, behold, we've left everything and we followed you. What's there going to be for us? We made all these sacrifices for you, Jesus. So, is it going to benefit us at all? How's it going to affect us? And he said, truly I say to you, you who have followed me in the restoration, Jesus talked about coming again when he left after his resurrection. He said, I'll come back. And so that's what he's referencing. This time when Jesus comes back to restore things, back to a condition, a similar condition to the way things started out when God made this whole world and humanity project in the first place. So in that restoration, when the Son of Man, Jesus, will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit up on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And it has the idea of not looking down your nose and pointing your finger at people in judgment, but handling cases, disputes between people. And so Jesus seems to indicate that his followers, when he comes back to restore the state of the world, closer to the way that things started, he's going to use his followers to decide cases and help in the decision-making process and handle disputes. And again, there's a lot of things that aren't described there, so we have to be too careful about making all these assumptions. But that seems to be where Paul's headed in his thoughts. He's like, you're going to have this responsibility in the future. He says next, do you not understand that we will judge angels? So now he's taking it up another notch. How much more matters of this life? He's saying, as a church, you're going to have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders someday, even perhaps making decisions concerning angels in order to manage everything that God has made. And that brings us back to what we read at the beginning of the service in Psalm. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you've set in place, what is human that you think of him or her? And a son of human that you are concerned about him or her? Yet you've made him or her a little lower than the heavenly beings, the angels, and you crown him or her with glory and majesty. You have him, her rule over the works of your hands. You have put everything under his feet, everything under her feet. I guess everything is a lot of stuff, even angels perhaps. I think maybe Paul was reflecting on that verse in Psalm 8, and he was thinking, well, everything, what does that mean? Someday maybe you'll even make decisions that affect or concern these angelic beings, which now are more powerful than you are. So Paul says, again, as a church, we're going to handle a lot of responsibility and decision making. So can't you deal with some of these matters and disagreements that are happening among you currently? He says, so if you decide cases dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them who are respected the least in the church? I say this to your shame. So he's saying right now as a church, when people come into conflict and somebody has a dispute with somebody else, instead of finding people within the church community that have wisdom and an ability to mediate and kind of figure things out, you're looking to the people down the road at the forum, the judges and the juries who are really biased. And you're going to that group of people to make your decisions. And these are people who are respected the least in the church because people realize the morals and the ethics and the values of those people down at the local courtroom and the forum. They don't match those of Jesus at all. And so he's saying, let's, again, better reflect Jesus as a church. We make decisions. We're going to figure out what kinds of decisions that Paul, probably the church in Corinth, is dealing with in just a couple more verses. But Paul's advice, it's given in the context of civil disputes over material possessions, and we'll get to those verses in just a moment, not criminal cases. And so the things that we're about to hear Paul say, and the things that Paul just said, he's not talking about criminal cases, because you could walk away thinking, well, you know, if we're not supposed to use the court systems, we just let everything slide, right? Criminals can do whatever they want, and, you know, we don't trust the court system. Remember, Paul's not talking about the United States judicial system. He's talking about the judicial system of ancient Corinth, right, in maybe 52 or 53 AD. So it's a different world. But the context isn't criminal disputes, ways that Christians and churches are committing crimes against each other. It's these different civil disputes that involve possessions, mainly, I think, money, because of the terms that are used. He says, so is there not among you one wise person who will be able to decide between his brothers and sisters? But brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. Not just unbelievers, but really dishonest people in a judicial system that has a bias toward people with money. Actually, then it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. And so we know that they very clearly were going to court. And we know who was filing the lawsuits. It was the more wealthy people in the church against other wealthy people or against people that were lower in class in the church. And they were settling disputes that way with power plays. So brothers and sisters in the church are putting a higher priority on their personal wealth and their social status than their relationships with each other. Because if you're taking somebody to court over some kind of material possession, what you're saying is that thing that you're depriving me of is more important to me, in effect, than you are. That's why I'm suing you. That's why I'm taking you to a place where you're going to have your character assassinated. You're going to be shamed. I'm going to try to make you, with my lawyer, look like a fool, again, in this ancient context, right? To get what I want and show people how I'm in power here and you are lesser than me. Again, in their context, that's what that's communicating. So Paul has some pretty serious issues. So they're leveraging their social rank and publicly attacking each other's character to be awarded more money or business contracts or inheritances. He uses a term in verses 7 and verse 8. It talks about depriving each other. And that's a word that's connected with finances, essentially, in the ancient world. And so it has something to do with money. You know, I need to get money from you because you didn't give me what I deserved. Or we had some kind of business dealing, and, you know, I need to come out on the winning side of this. Or in a lot of cases in ancient Roman society, it was arguments over inheritances. So you might sue your brother or your sister because maybe your father passed away or your mother passed away and there was inheritance coming your way, and so there's an argument. That would never happen in today's society, would it? Nobody would ever argue over money or inheritances. Yeah, so humanity hasn't changed all that much. But that was one of the biggest causes of disputes, and even in the church, apparently, at this point in time as well. But that was what it was about. It was not about relationships. It was about finances and money and inheritance and business contracts. So family members with less are being insulted and taken advantage of because they can't file the lawsuits. It's people that are above them, or maybe of similar class. But in a lot of cases, it was taking advantage of people that had less in some way. The community sees the church. They look at the church and they see a group of people who are just as committed to selfish living as they are. They see a group of people who don't love sacrificially. They see a group of people who could care less about injustices because they're the ones taking advantage of that unjust court system to make wins and gains, right? And so that's how people perceive the ancient church of Corinth. They're people just like us who want to get ahead, who want to be selfish, who are willing to use favoritism and injustice and maybe pay bribes and take advantage of biased judges and juries to get what they want. That's how the church is. So that's the kind of reputation that this church is developing in that community. He says, why not rather suffer the wrong? Why not rather be deprived? On the contrary, you yourselves do wrong and you deprive others. This is to your brothers and sisters. So Paul backs up and says, how do you perceive each other? When you look around the room this morning, some of you are newer, and so you don't know each other very well yet, right? But if you plug into this local church or another local church for long enough, hopefully the people next to you, at first they're strangers, right? They're kind of different. Some of them are way different. And then over time, even though people are different, hopefully they become friends. Acquaintances first, and maybe then friends. And then over time, if you're with people long enough and you're learning to love each other well, hopefully people feel more like brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. It's more of a family relationship that develops over time. And this church has been in existence for 4 years. So a lot of these people have known each other for 4 years and they have that kind of background, enough to call each other brothers and sisters. And so that's how they're treating each other as brothers and sisters, I'm willing to wrong you in order from, my gain. I'm willing to deprive you of something because I deserve it. You don't deserve it. I'm the one who deserves it. On the other hand, giving up material possessions to maintain right relationships, if you do that, like what if you just didn't file the lawsuit? Many of these people, they have plenty as it is. What if they just chose to take the hit and not file the lawsuit? At that point, they're putting right relationships with other people in their church community, other brothers and sisters, above whatever money or material possession they're trying to get in a courtroom. And people in the community are looking at this and going, why didn't so-and-so take somebody to court? They had every right to. And that gives an opportunity for them to realize they value their relationship with this person over money and possessions and status. And maybe that's what God values too. And I think it can also be something that's used to actually bring conviction. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 5:40. A lot of people read Jesus' words at this part of the Sermon on the Mount, and they think that Jesus is telling people to be a pushover, right? Just let people walk all over you as a follower of Jesus, take advantage of you. That's how it comes across to us, but that's not what it's saying. Jesus says in Matthew 5:40, if anybody wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. So at first glance, it's like if somebody takes you to court and they want your tunic, which is your main garment, think of it as like a really long t-shirt that goes down to your knees, your ankles, it's the basic garment. And then the cloak is something that you'd use more like a blanket that you would wrap around yourself, maybe when you traveled, take off at night, use to stay warm. And he's saying if somebody sues you over your clothing, give them that thing that keeps you warm at night too. Why would he say something like that? Does he want Christians just to be walked all over? Well, what happens when somebody sues you for something and you give them something like your blanket as well? A lot of people start to feel like a jerk at that point because they realize I took somebody's clothing, and it's not like you can just go down and buy a $10 shirt somewhere. I mean, these are handmade garments at this point in time in history. So I just took that valuable garment from somebody, and now I've got their thing that keeps them warm at night as well. What are they going to do tonight when it gets cold? What have I done to them? It makes a statement. If you're going to take my clothing from me and sue me over that, why don't you just have some more things too? Because obviously this is a lot more important to you than I am. and they begin to be convicted. And so sometimes it's not just about, again, being walked over. It's about making a statement that will cause people to think about the deeper implications of what they're doing. I've actually mistreated another human. I've taken some of the basic essentials from them in life. What have I done? It doesn't always result in that. Sometimes it does. I want to ask some questions at this point. Why do you think Paul urged individuals in the church in ancient Corinth to avoid taking each other to court? This is just to help us process what we've been talking about. Why does Paul say, I don't think it's a good idea for you guys to take your disputes to the courtroom? Yeah, exactly. They definitely are doing it, so he's got to say it. Bad example, because the people in the community. What else? Division, okay. Yeah, because you're mistreating, or you're kind of taking your status and using it as a power play against somebody else. And so that's going to cause one party to be offended and the other party to be like, I'm the hero, I won. So it's going to lead to division. Anything else? Why is that a problem?
He wanted them to talk to each other.
Yeah, right. Can we just have a conversation and work this out? On that note, I've seen this play out in churches. I actually had an instance, this has been like 20 years ago, totally different place, but I saw some individuals in a church who had a business disagreement. One person was a contractor, and they believed that some other people owed them some money on a project. The other people who owed them some money, this was a point when the economy crashed, and so they had nothing to pay that person with. And so how do you work that out? You can take each other to court and, sue somebody for everything they're worth, or you can try to work it out. And I remember sitting around a room with other people in a church community trying to work it out, trying to communicate, right? Trying to talk it out, figure out a solution. Is there anything that we can do to make a loving compromise, to preserve these relationships so people are taken care of, but we can still be friends. We can still be more than friends. We can represent Jesus well together, be on the same team together. How is our court system different than courts in ancient Rome? Can you take what we learned today and just bring it straight across? Say, well, what's the difference? Do you see any differences at all? Maybe there aren't any. Maybe there are. If there is a difference, what do you see? Let me throw out a couple questions. Do you have to be of a certain social class to file a lawsuit in the United States? No. So somebody who is poor could sue somebody who's rich. And that's something that couldn't happen in ancient Rome, right? I know people have different opinions, but overall, is our court system filled with bribery and corruption to the degree that the ancient Roman courtroom is filled with? Probably not. Some of you may feel that way, but not to that degree, right? Maybe there are some corrupt judges or juries that can be bought, but by and large, people are trying to bring about justice. And that wasn't the point of a Roman courtroom. It wasn't justice, right? It was other things, but it wasn't truly justice. And so there are some differences. And so when we get to questions like, should Christians avoid filing lawsuits today, we have to realize that there are differences. What do you think about that? Should followers of Jesus avoid filing lawsuits?
Depends on the topic.
Okay.
Such as child abuse, heck no.
Right. There's lots of reasons why people file lawsuits, right? Yeah. And so just to have, because I've known some believers, some followers of Jesus, who they read these verses and they believe that God's application to them is never sue anyone for any reason. I don't think that's what Paul's trying to communicate. I think he's trying to get us to think about the deeper principles that motivate us to do things like that. And as we do that, we have to consider the subject. In criminal cases, what Paul was teaching this church didn't even apply to criminal cases at that point in time. So that's not what we're talking about. When you talk about cases of abuse, or harm, that's not being addressed even in this conversation here in 1 Corinthians 6. But when it comes to things like disputes and conflict and disagreement, maybe there are things that can be handled well and adequately within the church through conversations. Through maybe working with mediators or leaders in a church or good friends to figure out viable solutions. And maybe there are other things that after an attempt to do so, or after you sit back, you realize this isn't something that can be settled here. And also, again, the purpose of the court system in the United States is to pursue justice. And part of the consideration is, how will I be representing Jesus when I file this lawsuit? Will the cause that I'm filing it for be something that Jesus would perhaps file a lawsuit for? Or is it something that when people figure out why I'm bringing this lawsuit, they would see somebody with different values than what Jesus might have? So what types of disputes did the church handle? What types of disputes did the courts handle? That's kind of what we talked about just a moment ago. That's a question for us to ask as we interact with these things. And then what principles should guide the way that we handle disputes? Do you think there's any basic principles that we've seen Paul point the Corinthians to as we talked this morning? Anything that you've seen? Like, what would you say is a basic, if you're considering handling a dispute between people or considering filing a lawsuit, what are some things you need to think about first? What do you think?
Stay calm.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because sometimes we react, right? Really, really quickly we react. And it's all pure emotion, and we haven't stepped back to figure out, what is this realistically? What are my motives? What happened realistically? Any other things you can think of? Empathy? Okay. Yeah, step in the other person's shoes and try to imagine what it's like to be the person that you are disputing, the person that you're in conflict with. How might they be feeling, given the way you're handling this? Yeah.
It's better to suffer righteously than to win sinfully.
That's a good thought. So if you have to violate your values and your character and Jesus' values and Jesus' character in order to win, maybe it's better to suffer the wrong. Yeah, it's a great thing to consider, for sure. Here's a couple thoughts I had. We see Paul emphasize relationships over material possessions. And not just Paul does this, but Jesus does this. He tells people who are in good relationships with each other, if you happen to have a little excess, look around you and meet the needs of the people that don't. Charitable giving is something that Jesus emphasizes. And so look around you and meet other people's needs. And so that's something that could be in a situation where relationships are great, right? But when there's conflict and when there's disputes, do you value the relationship over the stuff that you've had to forfeit, that you've been deprived of, or that you stand to gain? Also, emphasize sacrificial love over selfish living. Why is it really that you want to win? What is it that you're in for in this dispute? Is it selfish? Can you make sacrifices? Also, again, avoid misrepresenting Jesus to our community. When people look from the outside the church, people in our community around us, and they see the way that we're handling people and conflicts and disputes, what's their first impression? Do they think, wow, that is incredibly compassionate and patient and sacrificial of them, considerate? Or do they think, wow, that's incredibly selfish of the way those people are handling that? Those people really value themselves over anyone else in that community. I don't think I want to be a part of that community. How does it, impress people? Paul kind of closes off with these verses, and I'll just read them quickly. I'm not going to go into detail on them. He says, "Or do you not know that the unrighteous, those who don't exist in right relationships with God, each other, in the natural world, they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived." He's saying, what's your destiny? Are you really living like people that match the destiny that God has ahead for you, this kingdom that he has prepared? He says, don't be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, I have some of this kind of outlined, those who engage in unlawful sexual relations, prostitution, infidelity, incest, or idolaters, image worshipers, nor adulterers, those who seduce people who are married, nor, this is a technical term that's related to a homosexual practice in the ancient Roman Empire. If you want to know more, I can tell you more about that. Nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor those habitually drunk, nor verbal abusers, nor swindlers, those who financially abuse others will inherit the kingdom of God. That doesn't match with the way that God's kingdom is headed ultimately. So why would we as a church want to reflect those values? Such were some of you, but you were washed. You were sanctified. You were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. And so Paul's saying, God set you aside to different purpose. Your destiny is different. God's kingdom will forever be a community where people exist in right relationships with God, each other, in the natural world. That's the way that things are headed. That's what we'll experience if we're in Christ. And we're deceived if we think that acts of shaming people or devaluing people or depriving people or insulting people, which are all those court proceedings and the grocery list of abusive ways of living, which is what Paul was outlining. He was just giving more examples in a grocery list of different ways to abuse people and devalue people that were present in the Roman Empire at that point in time. Some of them are present in our day today, some of them are not. But he says, if you think that's going to be a part of life in God's kingdom, you're deceived. It's not going to be about that. But you were washed. You were sanctified, set apart. You were justified in the name of Jesus and in the Spirit of our God. So that may have been the former way of life, but our identity and our purposes have been changed when we recognize Jesus and we receive God's Spirit. So it's a different way of living. It's being Christ to our community instead of just focusing on ourselves. I think that's where I'll leave things this morning.